Avi Mayer is the immediate past editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. Before that, he served as AJC's chief storyteller, overseeing efforts to craft the organization's public image and directing its strategic initiatives. When the podcast comes out this Wednesday evening, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and U.S. President Donald Trump will have already concluded their meetings in Washington. The IDF will be stepping up action in Judea and Samaria, and hostage for ceasefire negotiations around Phase 2 of the deal will be underway. I'm Maayan Hoffman, executive editor of ILTV. Welcome back to the ILTV News Podcast, and welcome to you, Avi.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Now, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, as we said, is in Washington, D.C. He's meeting with President Trump. We can all pretty much assume what are those main issues that are on the table, the key issues that they're going to dive into. Trump has been very celebrated here in Israel, and I think I actually would like to start out just by hearing your thoughts as to whether or not you think that Trump is going to be the president that we all hope for the state of Israel.
Well, first of all, Maayan, thank you for having me. It's really a delight to be here with you. It's an interesting question because I think before he entered office, there was a lot of excitement and enthusiasm, particularly on the Israeli right, that he was going to be everything that they had hoped for and more, that he was going to enable Israel to beat down Hamas, he was going to facilitate the annexation of the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, and he was going to do everything that he wasn't able to finish on his first term. Now, since the conclusion of the first phase of the ceasefire deal, there are many on the Israeli left who are saying, actually, he's better for us than we ever would have thought. That actually he managed to push Prime Minister Netanyahu in a direction that perhaps he had been more reticent about prior to the president's term, that President Biden didn't manage over the course of many months to push the prime minister in that direction, and all it took was some strong handing, perhaps, on the part of the president and his emissary to push that forward. And so there's actually a lot more enthusiasm about Donald Trump on both sides of the political map, I think, today than there was previously. We'll have to see what that looks like in the weeks and months ahead.
Well, and it's interesting what you said, and especially with regards to this hostage for ceasefire deal, because as you mentioned, the Israeli right, a very small portion of the Israeli right, has actually even been hesitant about signing the deal and said we should continue to fight, which would then, of course, mean that our people would not come home. The majority of Israelis do, of course, want the Israelis to come home. But Trump is very strongly behind this deal. Trump has said that he wants to see Phase 2 and Phase 3, even though he said he's not sure we'll get there, but he certainly is pushing to complete it, which would eventually mean cessation of our fighting in Gaza, despite the fact that we know quite well that Hamas still rules the Strip. So, why do you think he's so invested in this if he wants what's best for Israel? How are we going to maintain Hamas on our southern border?
Well, I do think that there is something of a collision course going on here. We may not see it at the moment. You're going to see a lot of smiling faces and beautiful photo ops in Washington between the prime minister and, of course, the president and the other interlocutors the prime minister was meeting with during his visit. But those are two irreconcilable visions, right? On the one hand, the cessation of the war, the eventual end of the war, will necessitate some kind of withdrawal from Gaza. And there are significant voices in Israeli society, including in the current government, who believe that that is a risk that Israel cannot take.
I think even in Likud.
Even within Likud, absolutely. And so I think that is definitely something that we are likely to see again in the weeks and months ahead. But look, the president, when he was nominated, when he won the nomination, and then afterwards when he became the victor of the election, was very open. He said, I am not going to start wars, I'm going to end them. He views himself as a deal maker, as a peacemaker. I think there are those who suggest that he aspires to win the Nobel Prize for peace. And I think that is his goal here, right? He wants to end this. This is an unnecessary headache. He portrays himself, he views himself as being a friend to Israel. He's viewed by many as being one of Israel's greatest friends in the White House. But if he has this goal of ending the war and that runs counter to what the prime minister and people in his circle view as being in Israel's greatest interest, I think that is likely to create certain friction in the weeks ahead.
So do you think that the deal will go through Phase 3, or do you think it won't?
I think eventually we'll have to get there. I don't see any other way that this can end. The fact that the president is now sprouting these ideas of moving Palestinians to Jordan or Egypt or perhaps other places.
Albania, I think.
Albania,
I mean, that was a
I've heard
certain,
Indonesia,
right?
raises certain questions about what he views the end game as being. But I think that the conventional wisdom has been that this needs to be brought to some kind of a conclusion, and there really cannot be a conclusion to this war with the IDF still there. The war will still be ongoing if the IDF is still in Gaza. And so, again, those are two irreconcilable visions. The question is, what will win out in the end?
Sure. And I mean, I think also there's this piece of Saudi Arabia that we haven't touched on, right? Like, it's very interesting because as we're getting ready to start phase two, yesterday or on Monday, Netanyahu met with Steve Witkoff, the emissary you mentioned. And they had this meeting, and then he said, okay, let's kick off negotiations. They're sending Ron Dermer. And in fact, he's going to be very involved himself, Netanyahu says. Because why? Because it's going to be diplomatic in nature and not security in nature, which is really, I think, tied to this idea that we're going to have some kind of Saudi Arabia involvement and maybe even potentially a normalization or peace agreement with Saudi Arabia. So, I mean, do you think there's any red lines for the prime minister when it comes to Saudi Arabia? I mean, will he just give it all away, end everything in order to get that peace agreement? Or are there things that are going to be non-starters for him when he meets with President Trump? Can he say no to President Trump?
Look, the prime minister, I think, has always been torn between his sense of strategic vision and what he thinks is right for Israel in the long term and his immediate political needs. And the question is whether those two can be reconciled. There are many voices within his coalition, those who are in the further right parties, and also, as you said, within his own party, who don't think that any price is worth paying for normalization with Saudi Arabia, who think that there should be red lines that we should not cross. For example, leaving Hamas in power, they think should be a non-starter, and that should not be a price that we would pay in order to facilitate some kind of normalization agreement with Saudi Arabia.
What about the Palestinian Authority? Sorry to interrupt you, but I know that's also kind of a red line. Like, what do you think about that?
Look, I think that it is inevitable the Palestinian Authority will have some role in Gaza. But again, there are many in the government who think that that should not happen. They look at the experience of the West Bank, the profound weakness of the Palestinian Authority, the fact that the IDF has had to and is right now engaged in combat in order to beat down terror elements in the West Bank, despite the fact that the Palestinian Authority is present. They can't even imagine what that will look like in Gaza, where the Palestinian Authority does not currently exist, and would need to be significantly strengthened in order to play any kind of constructive role. And so, look, I think eventually there will have to be some kind of Palestinian entity. And Hamas had said, we're fine with it being the Palestinian Authority, which should give you pause and make you wonder
just remember
what they know.
2007, right?
Yeah.
When they were throwing Fatah
They were
off the
tossing
buildings.
them off buildings, exactly.
Right, yeah.
They know that the Palestinian Authority would be very weak and that it would be fairly easy for Hamas to influence them either directly or to take them over entirely, as, by the way, happened in Lebanon, right? Hezbollah is not officially in power, but Hezbollah has for years wielded outsized influence on the Lebanese government just by virtue of the fact that it is the stronger player in the territory. And so if that happened in Lebanon, they look at that and say, well, we could basically do the same thing in Gaza. But the fact that Ron Dermer is now being appointed to head this negotiation team, I think says two things. I think, first of all, it does say what you are suggesting, which is that there is probably a larger vision at play here, and there is an element of normalization with Saudi Arabia, perhaps an Iranian element. And this is all part of, if the president referred to his previous proposal for Palestinian statehood as the deal of the century, maybe it's the deal of the millennium, right? It's like this multi-part effort to sort of bring about peace and stability in the Middle East. And Ron Dermer, as the Bibi whisperer, as the person who is closest to the prime minister and has been for many years, would be a natural part of that. It would make sense that he would want to send his closest advisor to be a part of that effort. But I think it also speaks to the prime minister's desire to have a much closer hold on what's actually happening in the negotiations in Doha and Qatar. In the past, you've seen that when the head of the Mossad was leading those negotiations, there were sometimes differences of opinion within the delegation. You'd have conflicting reports coming out about how things are going and what Israel's position ought to be. I think if the delegation itself is headed by someone who is so close to the prime minister, it will enable him to keep a much tighter hold on those negotiations.
Right, and I was reading, I don't remember where, that maybe Netanyahu wants to see phase one be extended even further, and that we'll say, we'll do a little more phase one, and then we'll start talking about phase two. We'll see, I guess, what happens in the end of the day, I mean, one of the things that Saudi Arabia, though, is also asking for is a pathway, not a Palestinian state, but a pathway to a Palestinian state, which could be very vague. We had the former ambassador Michael Oren on the show recently, and he said how that like a pathway is just like a road of gravel. It could be anything,
right.
and that is true. But the Knesset voted very strongly against a Palestinian state. Our parliament, our democratically elected parliament, has said it is an existential threat to have a Palestinian state. So, I mean, is it worth it to actually allow something like that to happen for normalization with Saudi Arabia?
I don't know of anyone serious who thinks that a Palestinian state is in the immediate offing. I don't think that that's likely to happen in the very near future. I agree that the term pathway is so vague that there are many things that could potentially satisfy that need. You'll recall, of course, that before October 7th, it appeared as though we were on the brink of some kind of normalization deal with Saudi Arabia.
Without a state.
Without a state,
right.
And without a clear pathway, whatever that means. I think now that Hamas has successfully, we have to give it credit for this, put the Palestinian issue back on the international agenda, there is much more of an impetus and a drive, including in Saudi Arabia, to at least pay lip service to the notion of Palestinian statehood. But the Palestinians have not proven that they are ready for that at this stage. They're still deeply divided. There is no, forget territorial contiguity, there's no leadership contiguity between the West Bank and Gaza. And the Saudis aren't stupid. They know that this is not something that can happen overnight. And so I think that you're likely to hear a lot of conversations happening between U.S. and Israeli leaders about what could potentially satisfy that Saudi requirement for normalization. I don't know, by the way, that it needs to come from Israel. It's possible the United States would be the one to say, we are envisioning a Palestinian state that looks like this way and that, and that I think
maybe
could
they
prevent.
Could say we're going to build a golf course in Gaza, right? The resorts that Trump is thinking, and that will satisfy.
Look, he said it's prime real estate.
Yeah,
so
it's like pretty good.
Exactly, Trump resort Gaza. I think that there are any number of ways that this could go, and I think that if the Saudis were possibly reticent in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, seeing what they interpreted, perhaps rightly, as Israeli weakness and an Israeli inability to deal with the cataclysm of that day, I think some of that has dissipated over the past few months as Saudi Arabia has seen how Israel has responded forcefully to Iran, to Hezbollah, has decimated Hamas as a fighting force. I think that the IDF has gotten its groove back. And I think that Saudi Arabia sees that and views Israel as the asset that it saw it as before October 7th.
Interesting. And I mean, bringing up Iran, it's actually very interesting what you're saying because there's this whole Iranian question that sort of sits on the table, right? And one of the main reasons, we were working together at the time when there was this whole talk when Netanyahu went to the GA and said, yes, there's going to be normalization. And then, of course, October 7th happened. And at that time, there was this feeling that one of the main reasons that Saudi Arabia wanted the peace with us or the normalization with us was specifically because we could have a defense pact of sorts to be able to ward off the threat from the rogue regime in Iran, the Iranian regime. And then when we saw Hamas attack us on October 7th, exactly as you just said, we just looked like we didn't have our stuff together. And then, we're not the leader of this pact if we can't even protect ourselves from Hamas, let alone from Iran. And now we've kind of done this. Our retaliatory strike in October was like, wow, we've done a lot more damage than people know. So, I mean, what do you think are the next steps for that, though? Like, I mean, do you think that there's going to be a push for Israel to attack Iran, the United States? Where are we going with this?
Look, there have been reports in recent days that certain figures in the prime minister's circle are pushing for an arrangement that would see Iran and Saudi handled even before the war is brought to a close, even perhaps leaving some hostages there while this is going on. I don't see that flying.
Okay.
I don't think that the Saudis will be able to advance in any meaningful way with any kind of normalization plan while the war is ongoing. And I think it's inevitable that the war will have to be brought to a close at some point in the near future.
Well, couldn't it be a pathway to the war closing?
Exactly. Look, and there's something to be said for that, right? If progress is being made, if these stages are happening, if it seems as though the plan is proceeding as it's supposed to, maybe that could in itself satisfy the need to see this war being brought to a close. But I think that so long as there are Israeli troops and any significant presence in Gaza, I don't understand how the Saudis can view that as being a conclusion to the war. As to Iran, look, I think that there were many in Israel who had hoped that the president would take a stronger stance on Iran, would perhaps even threaten to or actually engage in military action to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear program. I don't think that is likely to happen. Okay. Again, a president who said that he's not interested in foreign entanglements is not going to invest American manpower and resources and firepower in what is likely to be a very damaging war in Iran.
Trump is a unifier and a pacifier.
Exactly. That is how he views himself. And so the question is whether they will give Israel the green light to do that kind of thing.
Do we need a green light from the U.S. to do that?
Do we need a green light? I'm not sure. Do we need American backing in case Iran decides to send another barrage of missiles our way? Potentially. And I think that engaging in any kind of military action without that level of coordination with the U.S. and perhaps other allies would be quite perilous, and I don't think that's likely to happen. But it's possible. There are other ways that this could end. Maybe there are ways of preventing an Iranian nuclear weapon that don't involve military action. Perhaps, as you and I had discussed previously, there's a potential of regime change, something happening from the bottom up, perhaps by damaging Iran's economy that would sort of generate this groundswell of support for bringing down the regime. But it's very clear that this has become an acute problem. It's something the Prime Minister has been talking about for nearly 30 years now.
Which makes it feel a little not acute, which is actually interesting because, you and I were also talking about this new report that came out in the last days from the New York Times about Iran, like sort of fast-tracking or rushing to get the nuclear weapon done. I feel like it's scary, and it's probably true because we weaken them and they need to prove, that they are strong. But I kind of feel like, you and I have been working in this field a long time, and we've heard it a lot. And as you said, 30 years. Remember the drawing at the UN, how many years was that? It was at least 10 years ago when Netanyahu stood there and drew the nuclear bomb and said, oh, Iran is imminently going to have a bomb, but last I checked, they don't. So should we be as scared? I mean, it's interesting because, like, as you say that, and then on the other hand, is it really as acute as we think?
Look, to the point that you just made, though, I don't know that Iran has ever felt as cornered as it does now, right? Okay. Its proxy army has been decimated, right? Almost all of its proxies have been smashed to smithereens. It still has the Houthis, but they are relatively weak compared to the others, which it had sort of relied on to project its influence and its power throughout the Middle East and the world. And so I wouldn't put it past them to say we need leverage, we need a strategic advantage, and that can only come in the form of a nuclear weapon. And so I don't take those reports lightly. I think it is certainly possible that they're going to fast track a path to some kind of crude nuclear weapon that would give them that leverage and say, back off. We are still a player to be reckoned with here, and you have to take us seriously.
Wow. Do you think they would use it?
That comes back to sort of the classic question of how rational the regime in Iran is. Many pundits will say that they're actually more rational than they portray themselves, that a lot of this rhetoric about wiping Israel off the map is mere rhetoric meant for internal consumption or whatever other purposes. I take that rhetoric seriously. So whether or not they intend to use it, I have to assume that they will if they have it, and they have to prevent them from reaching that capability.
And I understand they could also reach America, that there's ways that they could actually target the United States. So it's not just Israel.
Well, so first of all, they could easily provide any of their operatives with a dirty weapon that could be carried across in a variety of different ways. But we also know that they have been investing significantly in their ICBM capacity, in developing these missiles that have extended ranges, certainly to Europe and perhaps points beyond. So yeah, this is not only a threat to Israel, it's certainly a threat to many Western allies that share Israel's values, and this is something that should be of grave concern to everyone.
Yeah, so I think it'll be very interesting, to sort of see what comes out in the next few weeks. Now that there'll be these meetings in Washington and there'll start some of the strategic work together. There's been so many ideas, I feel like, put out in terms of what we need to do with Iran. But it sounds like, from what you're saying, what we're reading in the papers, maybe for 30 years it felt that it was imminent, but it really might be imminent now.
It does feel that way.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I mean, I want to take us back to the north just for a second. I was actually up there the other day, and it was really, really eerily quiet.
Mm-hmm.
It was quite astonishing because I've been up to the north many times to the different communities, and we're driving on these like back roads, whatever, up by the Lebanon border. There is not a single IDF soldier. There's not a single even equipment belonging to the IDF. It was
Wow.
like totally empty. There were, other than the jackals, no humans, no noise. It was like, wow, this is like I could picnic here. It was like super peaceful, and it's a real contrast to even a month ago driving up, and there were so many army vehicles. Like there were still few people, but so much of a feeling of like we're at war. And then we signed the ceasefire agreement. We just extended it till February 18th with Hezbollah, but that deadline is coming up pretty fast. And I'm assuming Trump is going to extend it, or we're going to try to formalize it and make it permanent. But do you think it's safe? The government has said that the residents of the north need to return by March, and they're going to stop the stipends. And here we know that Hamas still has a lot of control in Gaza. People in the south are not moving back, regardless of what's happening with the ceasefire agreement, at least for now.
Right.
So their homes are destroyed. In the north, I mean, what are your thoughts there? Do you think we're going to get the north back at this stage, or are we any different than we were before the war?
Look, I think if I were a resident of a northern community, I would think twice before coming back. I certainly cannot blame those who have been hesitant to return, because the ceasefire there does seem very fragile and dependent on the whims of Hezbollah. It's certainly true that Hezbollah has been significantly weakened, but they still do have significant capabilities there. The question is, what are their interests right now? Do they have an interest in restarting the war? I don't think they do. I think that their capacity has been significantly diminished, and they have lost a significant ally in Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria. The fact that he's no longer there means that they don't have that backing. They don't have that supply route that they had previously. And Iran, again, is significantly weakened. I don't know that it can maintain the capacity for another war in the north. And so I'm hopeful that the ceasefire does hold. There have been several incidents in recent days and weeks where Israel has felt a need to target certain individuals or vehicles in Lebanon, which in the past could have triggered a response by Hezbollah and have not. And so that could be taken as a sign that Hezbollah is committed to some kind of quiet, at least as it tries to regroup and rearm. That is something that Israel will have to prevent. But I'm hopeful that if not by March, at some point in the near future, residents of the north can start returning to their homes.
So let me ask you this, though. I feel like this is such a circular conversation in some ways with regards to what happens with Hamas, with Hezbollah. They're weakened. We've significantly damaged them. We're going to pull out. And in 5 years, aren't we going back? I just feel like 2009, 2014, 2021, to some extent, though that was a smaller operation. We just keep doing the same thing. Doesn't something have to change at some point?
Look, I think there are many things that have to change, and the situations are not wholly comparable, right? So in Lebanon, you have an extremely weak central government that has enabled itself to be co-opted by Hezbollah for so many years. There was a report just last week that there are officers in the Lebanese army who are leaking information to Hezbollah from within the Joint Command Center that's supposed to oversee the implementation of a ceasefire, which I find completely unsurprising because Hezbollah has infiltrated all the institutions of the Lebanese state. That has to change, right? And so the fact that you now have a new president in Lebanon who's not the greatest guy, but at least is someone who is filling this role that has been vacant for a very long time, could perhaps serve as an indication that the Lebanese state is starting to reassert itself and sort of reclaim its country, including the south, from the clutches of Hezbollah. And I certainly hope that happens, not least for the Lebanese people themselves. The situation in Gaza, I think, is somewhat analogous in that Hamas has sort of run rampant for so many years, has created these capabilities under the surface. They've now been decimated. The question is, how do you prevent them from reemerging?
The State Department obviously said that they recruited the same number of terrorists that we killed.
Right, but those are 15 and 16-year-olds.
Okay,
They're not
but
seasoned
in 2 years,
fighters.
They'll be 18,
That's true.
And in 3 years they'll be 20, whatever. And
they
all of a
haven't.
sudden they'll be strong.
You're not wrong. During the war, I had a conversation with a senior Israeli official, and I confronted him with this question. I said, how do you decimate Hamas? Hamas is an idea. It's not only a fighting force, it's also an idea, and it can regenerate, as you say. And he said, we're not concerned with fighting an ideology. We are concerned with fighting a fighting force, and we need to destroy them. That has been largely achieved, though not fully. There are still Hamas operatives in the field, as we've seen in each one of these hostage release moments. And I don't fully agree with that statement. I don't think it's shared by everyone in the government. I think that there is a need to de-radicalize Gaza to ensure that these elements do not reclaim the governance role that they've had in the past. And I think you have to see a process similar, quite frankly, to what happened in Germany after World War II and Japan, where these elements, these Nazi elements or these imperial elements had to be completely uprooted. And this ideology had to be replaced with one that preaches tolerance and democracy and so on.
How did they do that?
It was a very in-depth and quite frankly painful process where people were removed from public posts. They were barred from public posts. They had to completely change school curricula. They had a tight grip over the media for a while. And this was sort of complicated because Germany at the time was divided into different sectors. So the Russians did, a certain number of things, and the Americans and the French. Everyone had their own way of going about it, but the goal was consistent: that Nazism could not be permitted to reemerge, and therefore any vestige of Nazism had to be completely uprooted from society.
And how long did it take?
It took a very long time. It took decades. I mean, you still had people. We remember certain figures that emerged in the 80s who still had Nazi past and were spoken of in that way, and we had people asking questions about whether they should be holding any kind of public roles because of things that they had done as young people so many decades earlier. I hope Palestinian society reaches the point where they view Hamas and anything associated with Hamas as so toxic that they don't want it in their society. I have to say that some of the scenes that we've seen surrounding the release of these hostages, these bloodthirsty crowds cheering them on and jeering at them, by the way, in ways that were so reminiscent to me of how these people were brought into Gaza to begin with, right? They were surrounded 100%. By these crowds who were cheering for them. It's as though nothing changed. And so I hope things can change. I think it'll take a concerted effort. I think that this is a multilateral effort that we will have to engage in together with certain partners in the Gulf, in Europe, in the United States, and elsewhere. But I don't see how there can be any kind of peaceful coexistence or any kind of sustainable security for the people of southern Israel without some kind of in-depth, long-term process.
Wow, it's like so heavy. Like just thinking about this decades-long kind of brainwashing. Like maybe the best thing is to take 500,000 to Albania, 500,000 Indonesia, 500,000 right Jordan and Egypt. You got 2 million Palestinians move out. We rebuild Gaza, bring them back to the resort. They can work in the resort. But I'm just joking around when I say that.
I don't know how far off that is from President Trump's vision. It sounds actually quite similar to what he's been suggesting.
Right. I mean, the truth is, I saw there was this poll, that came out that said the majority of Israelis, like more than 75%, actually support Trump's idea. But of course they do. I mean, we all want to have peace and we want it to be easier on our borders. But I mean, in the end of the day, you can't really take people and say, okay, move out of your home, we're going to move you somewhere else. Though the truth is, I mean, part of not working with UNRWA is the idea that, we've been kind of forcing this refugee status for so long, and maybe people should stop being refugees and just start taking ownership of their lives.
Well, I mean, also there are two contradictory voices coming out of Gaza. On the one hand, you have people saying, how could we possibly leave Gaza? Gaza is our home. It has been for so many decades. The very notion is ethnic cleansing and transfer and all these other horrible things. And at the same time, those same people are saying, Gaza's not our home. Israel's our home. And someday we're going to return there and turn that into Palestine. So they have to figure out amongst themselves what is it they actually want. I tend to agree with you that it would possibly be impossible or exceedingly difficult to move so many people away, and there are all sorts of ethical and moral questions surrounding that as well. But at the end of the day, this is something that needs to be resolved. And I don't think the Palestinians are writ large going anywhere. Israelis are certainly not going anywhere. I have to figure out a way to ensure that there is a sustainable long-term quiet that enables both peoples to live at peace.
100%. So I'm going to ask you, we're going to run out of time, but I do want to ask you about one other area that I think you're really an expert in as well, which is anti-Semitism. You've been working, especially with the American Jewish community, for a very long time. Anti-Semitism is worse than it has ever been. I mean, worldwide. Right. Australia, I mean, out of control. But in America itself, we've seen the numbers spiking and spiking. Now, there was just something presented, I don't remember the details, of the State Department, so they're going to tackle anti-Semitism. But a little bit I feel like anti-Semitism got worse under Trump. And then it got even worse under Biden. But I think it was already going up. in that era. And I'm curious, do you think that Trump is going to be able to really stop it at this point? Is anti-Semitism the box open? Is the genie out of the box? And this is just going to get worse? Or is there something we can do to sort of pull this back and normalize for the American Jewish community?
Look, I think that anti-Semitism tends to manifest itself at times of great polarization. And agree with him or disagree with him, that was one of the markings of President Trump's first term. It was a very polarizing period in American history. And I don't think that is going to change in this term, just based on some of the things that you've been seeing over the past few days and weeks, some of the dramatic steps that the administration has been taking. It's likely that this too will be a polarizing period in American history, and that in turn will almost inevitably contribute to a rise in anti-Semitism. I think that a lot of it did exist below the surface and has been given sort of free rein over the past few years. I certainly don't blame President Trump, but I think that they have used his term, his leadership, as a pretext to let this anti-Semitism flourish, and the same is true of this war. I certainly don't blame Israel for anti-Semitism. I think that the very notion that the victims of anti-Semitism are responsible for it is repugnant, but it's certainly undeniable that many anti-Semites have used Israel's response to October 7th and the war itself as a pretext to let their hate be more publicly known. So I think the most dangerous thing that can possibly happen for anti-Semitism or for the fight against anti-Semitism in the U.S. is that it become a political issue. Okay. I think it should supersede politics. I think that to the extent that you can have Democrats and Republicans and independents coming together to fight the scourge, not only in one another's camps, but in their own, I think that is absolutely critical. I think we haven't seen enough of that. I think it's very easy for Democrats to point at the Republican Party and say, you have an anti-Semitism problem, and for Republicans to say the same of the Democrats. I don't see nearly enough Republicans trying to fight anti-Semitism on their side of the political map, and I don't see nearly enough Democrats doing the same. I think that is absolutely critical for this fight to actually succeed.
Wow. Yeah. So it'll be interesting. We'll bring you on in a year, and hopefully we'll be able to see some kind of, difference, or maybe before that, because, I like
pleasure.
to see you. But, anyway, we're going to wrap up. Is there anything else that you want to add, or is there something you think that a statement, something you want to say to people that you feel they should know before we wrap up?
Look, we've been through an extraordinarily difficult 15 months. It has been rough in ways that we possibly couldn't have imagined before October 7th, both in Israel and around the world. I think a lot of people are hurting. But I also see a lot of hope and optimism. I think we're seeing indications of rehabilitation, that this is a society that is extraordinarily resilient and that has proven itself equal to the task of rebuilding after cataclysmic events in the past. I think the fact that you have started seeing airlines coming back to Israel, tourists are coming back, some degree of normalcy is being restored in Israel, gives me hope that actually we will emerge from this even stronger. I think it's something that should give us the strength we need to make it through this rather challenging period.
Amazing. Well, Avi, thank you so much for being here. This was Avi Mayer, the former editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, and Maayan Hoffman, executive editor at ILTV, and thanks so much for listening to us.